Welcome to Dutch the Podcast. My name is Mike Wixon. Right there is Tom Byfoot. He is, after all, the man who is in charge of everything Dutch here in North America, it seems. Of course, Dutch the Magazine, Mokum Publishing, and right here, Dutch the Podcast. Hi, Tom Byfoot. How are you?
Hi, Mike. How are you doing? Long time no see.
It has been a number of weeks now, but congratulations. Season 1 is done. This is episode 1 of season 2. Look at us. We made it, Tom.
We did it. Next season going already. So looking forward to carrying on.
Now, I'll remind you, there are many episodes, as we point out. This is season 2. Season 1 is available now on YouTube. And if you're watching that here on YouTube right now, go ahead and subscribe and hit the notification button. And we'd be happy to let you know every time we put one of these out. Every episode has an amazing guest, and today is no exception. We'll find out more about our guest today in just a minute. Meanwhile, what's happening in the world of Mokum Publishing, Tom?
Well, it's things are going very nicely. We've just printed our July-August issue of Dutch the Magazine. Got some wonderful stories in there. Maybe one that I'll get back to in a future podcast. It's called In Your Father's Footsteps, and this is this great tour that was put together for children of Canadian vets who liberated the Netherlands after World War II. And they organized a tour, and they actually walked and they followed the route that the soldiers took. And they went and visited the towns they liberated and spoke to the people who lived there, some of whom remember the Canadians coming in, and many of whom, of course, are too young or were born later, but they're still very grateful.
It is legendary, I'm sure, in these communities. What a really interesting story and a great project. Look forward to finding out.
So I'll bring one of the participants on in one of the future episodes.
Before we leave today, I'll remind people of this, but you can visit us and contact us at any point. I would encourage you to do that. Get in touch at dutchthemedia.com, where you can find out all kinds of amazing things, including all of the various publications like Tom's book. We'll get to that before the end of the show, and hundreds of other publications. You could subscribe to everything and even catch the podcast there. Once again, we encourage you to reach out and even say hello to us.
Yeah, I'd love to hear from the listeners, viewers on YouTube, and listeners on all the various other platforms that the podcast is available on at dutchthemedia.com, and just fill out the contact form and it will get straight to me.
Now, I never do this, but one season later, I find myself in this position, Tom. Hi to Robert, my next door neighbor, who is a fan, and he's Dutch, and found out that his new neighbor is the host of the podcast that he watches. So I promised I would shout him out. Hi, Robert. Thanks for tuning in.
I haven't met Robert, but shout out to Robert from me as well, then.
All right. Now, listen, as always, we have a great guest. And as we head into season 2, who's our first guest, Tom?
Our first guest is an amazing filmmaker, architect, urban city developer, and general thinker out of the box. Her name is Astra Burka. And despite all of these amazing qualities that she have and amazing productions that she's made, she's a multi-prize winner with her films, for example. We will not be talking about her life. We'll be talking about her mother's life. Her mother, Ellen Burka, came to Canada from the Netherlands after World War II, was soon a single mom of two amazing girls, Astra and her older sister, Petra. Petra went on to become a world figure skating champion, and that would not have happened without her mother's chutzpah, as we discover when we're talking to Astra. So I'd say let's go talk to Astra first, and then we'll maybe evaluate and talk a little bit more after.
We'll break it into individual discussion groups, have coffee, and we'll talk about it. Meanwhile, here is the interview.
Hi, Astra. Thank you so much for joining me on Dutch the Podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking to you. And maybe by way of introduction, you can start by telling me a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yes, as you know, my name is Astra Burka, and I have I was a figure skater. My mother was my coach, and from the age of 4 to 16, I trained 6 hours a day at all the rinks, and it taught me discipline. I have 2 university degrees, one from Glendon College in English and French, and one from the University of Toronto in architecture. And also, I'm a filmmaker, production designer, producer, and currently I'm the co-chair of sustainability for the Directors Guild of Ontario.
You've got an amazing career, a huge number of things you're involved in. I met you a number of years ago at a Dutch consular event here in Toronto, and when we spoke about you coming on as a guest on the podcast at the most recent Dutch consular event, I asked you, what would you like to talk about? Would you like to talk about your own filmmaking, your urban planning work, or about your mother's story? And you said, no, I would like to talk about my mother's story on this podcast. So can you explain why that is?
Well, I think maybe I will change my mind a little bit, but because I would like to mention a couple of items about my own personal life. I just be just to explain, because when we immigrated to Canada, we weren't really told about the total family history. And when I did find out, I became obsessed about it. And then I started making films about all my family members, just as a way of paying homage and having a historical account of all of that. So that was kind of, I got that through my filmmaking, but I did, as an architect, I just want to go briefly about that. I loved architecture, but I found that it's too development driven. People don't think outside of the box. We have a city that doesn't have a plan in Toronto, and it's ridiculous how we're condomizing the entire city with these huge towers that are not even built for climate action. And I was writing articles in the 80s, bury the gardener and beautify the city. Let's make the greatest waterfront. And that was when we had the opportunity, when Canary Wharf and all Barcelona, Paris, all Boston were making great plans with water in their cities. And you know, here it's always very frustrating as a creative outside the box thinker to do architecture. So I somehow got involved with film because I thought, you know, at least you can build a set, a movie set, and it gets done right away, and it's about storytelling. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. And then because I learned my skill from architecture to becoming a production designer, I thought, well, why don't I make my own films? And I knew nothing about that. And the very first film I made was called Innocence on Ice. It was a Bravo Fact. I got some money from Bravo Fact, and I found old footage that my aunt in Amsterdam had of my sister in the 60s, Super 8 film. So I had an editor edit it. It was just a 3-minute film. And then I hired composers to compose music to her movement. And so that's how I started in my filmmaking.
So that was your first film. Can we see that somewhere online?
Yes, it's if you looked up Bravo Fact YouTube Innocence on Ice, you would
Innocence
find
on
it.
Ice. Okay. And that was the first of many, right? I looked at your filmography on IMDb. I don't know if you know exactly how many you made, but one of them that I think really stands out is the film you made in 2007 about Ellen Burka, your mother.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Skate to Survive. It was funny because I'm not, I'm not really a filmmaker. I just have ideas. I'm a outside the box thinker. When I have a passion or a mission, like when I wanted to get into architecture, I applied in September and got in when 1,200 applicants applied at U of T, and only 70 were accepted, and I was 71. You know, it's called chutzpah, you know, when you're on a mission.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so there was hot docs, and the hot docs, which is similar to the IDFA Documentary Film Festival in Amsterdam. I decided, I'm going to pitch at Hot Docs this film, and I had a couple of pages of pictures of my mother, and I pitched it to Omni, and they gave me money. I couldn't believe it. Like, I'd never done a 1 hour documentary, and they gave me money. And I worked with Michael Kaner, who was co-producer and writer to the film. And together we put together a film where we shot it in Toronto, and we went to Amsterdam. And I'd never done anything like that. And I got into some festivals, and I went to Israel to a couple of festivals and played at Yad Vashem, and so it was kind of exciting, actually doing something like that.
So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your mother's story and what made it so compelling to make a film about it.
All right. Well, the title, Skate to Survive, that really is the telling title. My mother was a figure skater in Amsterdam, and she loved figure skating, and she got her friend Elspeth von Meyer, her name was Elspeth Meyer, to skate with her, and they used to go to all the rinks. And
we're talking pre-World War II, right? We're
Pre-World
talking
War II.
late
This was
1930s.
in the 30s. And she loved figure skating, and they, went everywhere, and they had lessons and everything. But then the war came, and the Germans said, no Jews allowed. My mother was Jewish, so she wasn't allowed to go to the skating rink anymore. And she used to walk around the rink and hear the people skating, but she wasn't allowed in because she was a Jew. And she was sent to Westerbork with her parents and grandmother.
Westerbork is the transit camp where the
It was
Dutch
the transit
Jews
camp
were gathered before they were sent to the extermination camps in the
Right.
east.
Right, exactly. So, and Westerbork had quite a history too, because it was a German camp before World War II, where all the German Jews escaping Germany would go to Westerbork. And then apparently the same doctor and cook worked for when it became a Jewish camp for transit. I mean, it's crazy. And then after the war, it became an Indonesian camp.
That's right.
It's really crazy.
Yeah.
But anyway, so my mother and her parents were sent to Westerbork in June 1943. And when you inscribed in the camp, they asked, what your profession was. And people would say, landscaper, furrier, whatever. And mother said, champion of Holland. Even though she wasn't the champion of figure skating, she said.
Yeah, you talked about chutzpah, right? That's another great example.
Yeah,
she was a student. She was a great figure skater, and I think what in your film she says, well, there were no championships at the time, but if there had been, I would have won it. So I thought it was okay to say that.
Yes, and she did win it immediately after the war when she was 3 months pregnant with my sister.
Wow.
So in 46, but anyway, so she wrote that down, and Gemmeker, who was the Obersturmführer of the camp, loved figure skating, and so did his mistress, and so somehow she got protected when she was in the camp, and they didn't send her to Sobibor. Her parents and her great grandmother was brought to the camp 2 weeks earlier than my mother and her parents, and she was sent to Sobibor. So my mother got to see my great grandmother Clara Daniel just as she was being sent away, and she was 83 years old. And then 2 weeks later, her parents were sent to Sobibor and were murdered there. And mother was told, okay, your parents are on the train, please go and say goodbye to them. And she said her mother or her father, I can't remember which one, didn't want to look at her because it was just a horrible situation. And somehow she got protected. I think my grandfather went to the Yotzerat, which is the Jewish council that was at the camp. They always, made the list of which Jews should be sent. I mean, it was so ridiculous. And he said, I want you to protect my daughter, Ellen. And so maybe it started like that, and with her skating. So that was that. And then I think the story that you might have seen is that the Germans wanted her to skate an exhibition in the camp. And so she phoned her friend Elspeth. She was able to get on a telephone and phone her friend Elspeth. And Elspeth brought her skates and her dress to the camp. They couldn't see each other, but she had it delivered through a farmer or something. But then the ice melted, so my mother was never able to perform.
But nevertheless, she because she had that camp commander who was really interested in ice skating and figure skating. She survived, or she was not sent to an extermination camp like your grandparents were, but she was sent to Theresienstadt, which was also a German concentration camp,
Yeah.
but at least not a death camp. And she survived that. And then what happened?
Well, I'll tell just one other story. In Westerbork, she was a cook. There were three Obersturmführers, the highest commander, and the second and third, and she worked for, I think, architect Wimme. And when we were in Westerbork, we saw the one house where Gemmeker lived, because that's still preserved. And she was asked to do a party one night, but not to wear the Star of David. She had to serve alcohol and food to who the guests were at the house, at Gemmeker's house. And she started drinking too much champagne and got a little bit tipsy. And one of the other German soldiers tried to corner her in a room, and Gemmeker saw her and said, out you go, leave, because, it was just one of those situations. So she was put in a prison with 99 other women. And somehow those 99 women were sent to Auschwitz. It was the last train to Auschwitz, and Frank was on that train also. And Mother was sent on the last train to Westerbork because the Obersturmführer's, Gemmeker's mistress, put out a petition and asked if Ellen could be saved. So she was sent to Theresienstadt.
Wow. So yeah, again, she survived because of the relationship she had built which came through her ice skating. Now she met a Czech Jew in Theresienstadt, your father, and then
Yeah.
what happened next?
Well, my father was an artist, and his brother was making furniture for the Germans. He was a carpenter, and my father was a painter, so they allowed. And my father also worked in the kitchen, and that's where my mother got a job. If you work in the kitchen, you get fed. And but my father somehow had an atelier over the children's barracks, where he had a studio where he could paint. And so he made paintings up there, painted my mother. I have some portraits that I think are in Yad Vashem in Theresienstadt. So she met my father there in Theresienstadt. So they fell in love in the camp. And then,
sorry, go ahead.
And then the Russians liberated the camp. So I think my mother told the story that she was on a Russian army tank with my father coming into Prague, liberating it.
Really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah. And so it was like kind of crazy because, see, my father, he was actually, just backtracking on my father, he was from Sudetenland, which was German speaking. And my mother's parents also came from German background, which also helped my mother because she could speak German fluently, and she spoke Hochdeutsch, which is High German. So my father was sent from Sudetenland. He went to Prague, and then he was kicked out of every school, but he met this artist called Peter Keen, who told my father, if you want to be an artist, you have to have another profession. So he said, I'll teach you graphic design. So my father learned graphic design, and I still have drawings, graphic design from my father that he did before he was sent to Theresienstadt. And that's what my father became afterwards. He became both an artist and a graphic designer. And
And then so your mother and your father met in Theresienstadt, and then
yeah,
after the liberation, I understood they walked back to Amsterdam.
yep, they walked back to Amsterdam, and mother said that she bumped into soldiers, like German soldiers with watches up their arms. And, it was like very dangerous because they had to go through creeks and this and that. And then they walked back to Amsterdam. And then, of course, my aunt, I think, was underground, and then she worked for UNRWA, so she wasn't in Amsterdam, but somebody was occupying the family house in Amsterdam South.
And
So that was sold during the war in 1943 to a Dutch couple.
but sold by whom?
It's so crazy. I found the documents, which are gone to the Amsterdam archives, but I found a document um, in November 1943. A makelaar, real estate agent, sold the house to a Dutch couple.
but it wasn't his to sell. It was your grandparents'
No, but the
house.
Germans took everything. They took their bicycles, their cars,
Yeah.
everything.
So it had been confiscated, really taken away,
And
stolen.
yes, and then whatever remained of the family articles, like some china and silver and some uh, smaller items, they were hidden in a warehouse in Amsterdam through Elspeth's father, who was in the Iraq business. It was kind of an alcohol from Indonesia, and so he hid um, a number of jewels and china and photographs. And so after the war, we still had photographs of the whole family history because they were hidden during the war. So that was interesting. But the house, the Dutch law at the time said that in order to gain um, your house back, you have to move in with this other couple. So my father and mother had to live with this Dutch couple in the house that my mother owned to get it back.
Wow. And
The
she did
Dutch
get
were
it
not,
back?
pardon? Yes, she got it back, but the Dutch were not, nobody was, people weren't happy when the Jews came back. Like it was not really, like welcome. They either taxed them for back bills so they couldn't afford to get their houses back, but my mother somehow managed to get the family house back.
Now, isn't there also, because as you say, the reception of the Jews coming, the few that came back, uh, wasn't really welcoming. Was there something about your mother having lost her nationality by marrying a Czech so-called alien?
No, I think she was Dutch.
Okay, so she
Like my father might have been an alien or stateless, but she was born in Holland, you know,
and she did
family,
have a Dutch citizenship, but nevertheless, uh, so you and your sister were both born in Amsterdam after the war,
right?
but fairly soon you the family moved to Canada, right?
That's correct. Well, it was in 51. My father, when the Korean War started, because what happened in Czechoslovakia, first it was Sudetenland, then it was the Germans, and then the Russians came in 48 and took over Czechoslovakia. So my grandparents on my father's side had to escape Czechoslovakia with the clothes they had on their back. They left a farm. My grandfather was an engineer. They had this big farm in this crazy little town called Pustelopati, something crazy like that. They lost everything and they immigrated to Canada. So my father, this was in 48, but in 51, my father got totally paranoid because, the war damaged everybody who had to go through the camps and everything. So he was terrified again there would be another war with the Korean War. So he said, let's immigrate to Canada. And mother said, well, I have relatives in New York, so whichever visa comes first, we'll go to that country. And it was the Canadian visa that came first.
Okay. So now, how was the reception in Toronto in Canada?
Well, when my parents arrived in 51, my mother being a figure skater, and she had won the Dutch championship, and she created a beautiful ice review with the Carré in Holland, and she was teaching. She was very well educated in figure skating, and she noticed when she came to Toronto, she said, "I'm putting my finger in the middle of the city, and that's where we're going to live." And so we found a 3-bedroom apartment near Upper Canada College on Oriole Park Road, and it was a nice neighborhood. We weren't poor immigrants. We came on the Queen Mary, maybe third class or whatever, but we weren't poor immigrants like most of the Dutch immigrants who came. My parents spoke 5 languages. They were educated. Um, and my mother had a little bit of money that Elspeth's father had saved from my grandfather who had given to Elspeth's father. So, but everyone else didn't help in Holland. So they came to Toronto. Mother noticed there was this private club called the Granite Club that was just around the corner on Sinclair Avenue. And she said, I'm going to join. So she went to them and said, I'd like to become a member of your club. And she saw no Jews allowed.
This is Toronto, early 1950s. No Jews
Yes.
allowed at the club.
In the Granite Club. It wasn't until the 60s,
Wow.
I think, or early 70s, that Jews were allowed to become members of the Granite Club. So it was like a very WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant place. And so my mother totally freaked out, I'm sure, and at that point decided, well, I can't have my children, be raised Jewish here. And she had already denied being Jewish because of the war. And she said, I can't tell my children about the past. So she said that my grandparents died in a car accident. So my sister and I knew nothing about any relatives, anything.
So you, growing up, you did not know you were Jewish. You did not know what had happened to your grandparents and your great grandmother, and you thought they died in a car accident.
Yes, my sister and I, and my father had these crazy relatives that were, also Jewish here in Toronto. And but nobody ever talked to us. Like it was always silent. My sister and I kind of felt there was something weird. My mother.
Yeah, I was going to ask. You must have, especially when you get into your teens, you must figure out, there's something here that doesn't quite add up.
Well, we just thought, like we came from home, we were immigrants, we were foreigners, because they also called us displaced persons. Like for us, Petra and I, it was harder for us because they said, "Oh, your name isn't Mary or John," like why are you Astra and Petra? Like we had strange names, so we always felt as if we were foreigners. So we never kind of questioned if we were Jewish or anything. And Petra and I even went to a public school called Glen Rush at the time, where it was mostly Jewish children. And on the Jewish holidays, Petra and I would always go to school, and because we didn't know we were Jewish. And so it was kind of strange, but we associated our background more being immigrants and foreigners, and Canadians did not like foreigners.
Despite hundreds of thousands coming in round about that time,
I know it
Dutch,
like
Italian, Portuguese.
Like they treated the Chinese and the Japanese, and even the Jews had to, Mount Sinai Hospital, they had to create in Montreal because Jewish doctors were not allowed to work in Toronto General, here in the 30s. They had to create their own Jewish hospital. Like Jews were only allowed to be accountants here.
Wow. So but eventually your mother did take up coaching and skating again, right?
Oh, well, she started teaching at Varsity Arena, and and did all the Lakeshore Arena, Dundas. Like she was going around everywhere, teaching. And then when Petra and I were like 11 and 13, we became members of the Toronto Cricket, Skating, and Curling Club. And there, no Jews allowed either. But Mother said we were Anglican. So Petra and I were skating in a club where no Jews allowed. We didn't know we were Jewish. And we thought we were Anglican. So
So, who was your mother coaching there at the time yet, or did she just
not
enter
yet.
you?
She was teaching in all these arenas because, just to backtrack, after 4 years, my parents split up in Canada. They were only together for 4 years, and then they divorced. And so my mother was a single mother, having to raise two children. And my father left for New York and the south of France, so he was nowhere around. And Mother had to work in all these arenas, like it was insane, and pick us up and bring us to school, and at the same time maintain a middle class type of upbringing. We always lived in houses, and she sent us sometimes to camp in the summer. So. But it was very hard for her, what she went through. And so she couldn't even train my sister. When my sister became an international figure skater in competition. So Stafford Smythe, who owned Maple Leaf Gardens, actually gave her 3 hours of ice time at Maple Leaf Gardens to train in the morning. And I used to go with my mom and sister before the hockey players came on. And my mother was able to teach my sister. And then the following year, I believe she started teaching summer school at the Toronto Cricket, Skating, Curling Club, and then she was able to teach there full time. But people didn't know we were Jewish.
No, and your sister eventually went on to become world champion and
Right.
and win an Olympic medal.
Yeah.
But your mother coached a number of other world champions as well. She had great impact on figure skating in Canada and worldwide.
Right. She got the Order of Canada in 1978, which was quite early. She was the first figure skating person to get the Order of Canada for elevating the sport to artistry.
And that's what I found fascinating about watching the documentary as well. She had a creative impetus on skating. She changed the way skating was done, so to speak. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, because I think when my sister was skating, it was still very, this was in the mid 60s, was very traditional. And then she got this skater called Taller Cranston, who was very artistic, and he became her kind of creative tool. Because as she always said, men in the olden days could only skate like with their arms like this. And then she made him go and bring his arms up like this, like men weren't allowed to even raise their arms. It was so old fashioned. So she brought in this whole new way of men becoming artistic in the sport. And that started a whole new movement, and also with women. And Mother was always like taping music, classical music. She understood dance. She understood.
Yeah, she trained as a dancer as well, I believe, right?
Yes. And so she understood all of and choreography. So she was like a Renaissance woman. But people weren't really ready yet in Canada till I guess the 70s and late 60s, for this kind of movement to happen in Canada, because people were very uptight here. They still are.
So you're talking about the reception in Canada, but in the Netherlands, it also took a long time before your mother was recognized for her contributions to ice skating. Isn't it until fairly recently that in the Netherlands they really didn't know much about her influence on the sport?
Well, I think they did. She got a little award when NOS did the film on her.
But that's
But they
after
always
2000.
knew, I know, but they knew with Shoutje Dijkstra and Petra, like I think the Queen came to Dortmund And Petra actually beat Schoutje with the Dutch judge. I can't remember exactly. She got higher marks in free skating or something at the World Championships against Schoutje, which was quite something at that time. But I think they knew about Mother, but Mother was Canadian at that time. She wasn't into the sport in Holland. But for me, the most rewarding thing by doing the documentary was bringing Mother back to Holland. And that to me, because she had to escape Holland and then coming to Canada and then having to deal with all the forces that were going against her here, and that she was such a success, and then coming back to Holland and then getting the recognition, I think was for me one of the most wonderful joys of my life. Just getting her back there, and also another thing is the Amsterdam archives have now taken all my mother's archival material. I've sent it all, like I think I don't know how many kilos of photographs and paper are now in the Amsterdam archives from her life with her family from 1910, when her parents got married, till she left in 1951. So that's another achievement, getting her whole life back to Holland.
Wow. Yeah. Astra, we've been talking about your mother, but I was wondering, you grew up without knowing that background until you were told, in your late teens. How did it impact your life? Did it impact your life? Did your mother's background impact your life at all?
Oh, yeah, my mother was a huge force majeure in our lives. Like, she was larger than life. She was a real character. Um, and she was wild and crazy and creative. But when she told my sister and I, then it started making sense to both of us. But we didn't really tell anyone because, of this whole kind of hidden time. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go to Israel and become Jewish, and become a Jew and live in a kibbutz. And so I went to Israel and I thought, that's what I'm going to do, to declare I'm Jewish. And then one day somebody talked to me about Black Jews in Africa, and they said they're kind of not, like they're discriminated against in Israel. And I thought, how can you discriminate against Jews? I was like just in my early 20s, and I was so upset about that I thought, I can't do this. You have to accept everybody. And so I was very upset about that little incident.
I imagine, yeah. And you still live in Toronto? You grew up in Toronto. Is there any connection with the Netherlands that you feel?
Oh yes, like I I'm involved with the Dutch consulate. I'm involved with a committee called Dutch Canadian Circularity Alliance because of my architecture and film background and sustainability. I'm very interested in finding solutions. As I said, I'm a co-chair of sustainability for the Directors Guild of Ontario, and we're trying to make the film industry green. And so the Dutch have all kinds of creative solutions on how to reuse, repurpose materials, and coming up with all kinds of interesting infrastructure that are working with Canadian companies. And I figure if the film industry gets on track, like not to use diesel and use battery and hydrogen solutions, then maybe it will influence other industries.
Yeah, that sounds something like I can see you cooperating with the Dutch consulate on that.
Yeah.
Astra, it's
And,
been great. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry, one more other thing. I go to Holland. My mother's best friend, Elspeth, his daughters, Maria and Yoti, who are violinists and pianists, are kind of the same age group as my sister and I visit them. We keep in touch, and my mom and Elspeth were best friends for 80 years. And so my Dutch connection is with Maria and Yoti.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I saw in your film and in the film that I watched on Dutch television about that close friendship. and so you're keeping that friendship into the next generation. Now, your mom passed away in 2016, I believe.
Yeah. And
What
so
about
did
Elspeth?
the same. They both were born in the same year. They died in the same year. They both had two daughters, and Elspeth became an international judge, and Mother became an international coach. So the two of them used to meet during competitions.
That's beautiful. What a beautiful
Yeah.
story of friendship through through the war period and 50, 60 years afterwards. Um, Astra, where can we watch your films?
Well, the Skate to Survive is somebody downloaded it on YouTube. So it's Skate to Survive um, YouTube, and you could just say Ellen Burka, and you could probably find it there because it's on YouTube. And the other films, if you went to YouTube, it said Bravo Fact, Astra Burka, you could find. I did films called Innocence on Ice, Painting Daddy, My Titanic Uncle, and Zuko Pomodori.
Okay, so on YouTube, search for Astra Burka, Bravo
Bravo.
Fact, and we should be able to find them. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention for those of our listeners who understand and speak Dutch, the documentary on Andere Tijden Sport can be seen on NPO Start. That's another a film that was really based on your film. I gather, Astra. And it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Is there anything you'd like to add, Astra, at this point?
Not really. I'm just really happy that, I got the family history out a little bit and, highlighted my mother and my sister and my father. I just think I'm very proud about that.
Well, and so you should be, and your own achievements. Let's not forget that. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Astra, for talking to me.
Okay, and thank you, Tom.
Bye bye.
Okay, well, we are into season 2 and episode 1 with an amazing interview. Astra, thank you very much. And Tom, that's
What a story, right? The way her mother survived the Holocaust just basically by bluffing and by skating. She still suffered when she was in the Theresienstadt camp, but she wasn't sent to death camp. And I think and then she came to Canada and she became the most important person in Canadian figure skating ever. She completely redefined the style with her students. Fantastic. Now, I would like to say that I wrote about Astra's mother, Ellen, in Dutch the magazine, and I also have her life story in my book, Hiding in Plain Sight, where I cover the lives of a number of Dutch Canadians, Dutch Americans, and of course other items of interest about the Dutch in North America. So, of course, Ellen Burka deserved a place in that book.
Another fascinating story. And as I mentioned off the top of the show, please go back in time and visit the rest of the amazing episodes that we've had here on the show. Tom has a knack for finding these incredible stories. And of course, next time we will have another one for you. I'll encourage you, reach out, say hello to us. Is there something you think we should be covering or a topic you would like to see? DutchTheMedia.com. And meanwhile, Tom Byfoot, it has been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing with us today.
Thanks, Mike. See you later.